What's going on, Imperials? It's Emperor Cubone here. We're all familiar with the origins of the Pokémon series, getting its humble beginnings in 1996 with Red and Green in Japan, quickly followed by Red and Blue in the rest of the world, resulting in a crowning achievement that has maintained prominence to this day. I'm honestly a little bit shocked by how many kids love Pokémon just as much today as they did back in the heyday of Pokémania. And of course, the Kanto region and all of its Pokémon have become iconic and recognizable the world over, but what if they weren't? What if Kanto wasn't the first region of Pokémon, and we had to go with one of the other ones? Could we find a replacement that would still have created the same lightning in a bottle effect that immediately launched Pokémon into the stratosphere? For instance, if we had gone with the Hisui region, I doubt it would have had the same impact. Sure, seeing the world of uniquely crafted monsters would still be fun, but remember that this would still be on the Game Boy, so it's not like they would have the open areas, camera control, or even the ability to aim your Pokeball throws, which would just leave us with the story, and honestly, in a handheld Gen 1 world, that would leave a lot to be desired, because you'd have so many stretches of getting lost in the wilderness, with no cities or general landmarks to tell you where you are. It would be awful on such a tiny screen. So I feel like Hisui would not have captured the same attention for Pokémon if they started that way. Plus, half the fun was seeing references to other things, so without the other materials as a focal point, it would all fall flat. But I do think there are some options available where Pokémon still could have had a smashing success. But if you want to have a smash success, you can check out today's sponsor, Red Pro Club. This retro Game Gear retailer sells old video game hardware from varying generations that they've refurbished to the point of being like new. Like maybe you want a Game Boy Advance, or to check out the new 3DS XL. They completely restore the old consoles such as this, and make them work like you just bought a new one on opening day, without any smudges or scratches. And maybe the best part is they come preloaded with so many games. You can't even get some of these games today on the market, let alone the eShop, so that could be worth the price to some people who never got to play these games before. Or even for ones that you used to play all the time, like another kind of Smash success by playing Smash for 3DS. You can go to redproclub.com today and use promo code EmperorCubone for 10% off of your order of refurbished hardware with complimentary games right now, and it might even lead you to discover a Pokémon region that could have been the original first. Although probably not Alola if we're being honest, because it would be a little odd to start the franchise with trials that would probably make it the norm going forward, and also the fact that you would have to scroll manually through each island just to fly around due to the limited hardware would not be great, but let's focus on what would work, shall we? I've narrowed the prospect down to 3 likely possibilities, starting with Unova. Everyone complains about the simple layout of the Unova region being so linear, but that might be a benefit for such an early game to let people ease into this world a little bit. Although the actual first gen had a more open middle, so you could argue either way, I suppose. My main reason for considering Unova is the reboot angle of the roster, where it has pretty great allegories for most of the Gen 1 Pokémon, so you could still latch on to multiple bug options, or an elemental horse of some kind, or the fossil of your choice, or even trade-exclusive evolutions if you hate having fun. However, if these were the first Pokémon games, we run into the problem of who to use as the mascot, since famously, Unova didn't have any Pikachus in it, so are we gonna go with Zorua, or Minccino? Or even Victini, maybe? I could see that, I guess. Whichever way they go, you have to admit that the Gen 5 designs are a bit more polarizing, shall we say? There are great, but also not so great ideas, and they kind of lack the just outright weird factor that brought some of the original Pokémon charm, like Exeggutor, Lickitung, and Weezing. Plus, the gym layouts here are pretty complex and couldn't really be replicated properly, so in theory Unova could work, but it's still only number 3. For number 2, I actually think Hoenn could be a solid contender. This region was designed not long after Kanto, so it's not hard to imagine a Gen 1 coat of paint over all of these routes and cities because they weren't that convoluted in the first place. Even Sootopolis and its gym could be recreated in the older style, so the structural aspect is already covered. But I do have some reservations about the story. It might be a bit much to stop a destroy the world plot in the first ever Pokémon games, but the rivalry between the teams is nice to have, and highlights the differences between Ruby and Sapphire versions, so maybe. But I also think the Pokémon themselves are really nice across the Hoenn region. both in geographical distribution as far as team building, but also actual inspirations of their designs, giving it a classic feel like Kanto, but with its own flair. Wurmple becomes both of the early route bugs. We've got cats and dogs and mushrooms, but they put their own spin on a Magikarp stand-in, and a contentious relationship between fighting Pokémon, but this time they are not related. Not to mention a line of seal Pokémon that don't end embarrassingly. Hoenn also gives us a decent spread of rare or non-existent types in the original first games, with Dark, Steel, Fairy, Dragon, and especially Ghost on full display. So I would argue the Gen 3 roster is a much better representation of the type chart on the whole, with its increased variety, and it doesn't have so many repeats of the same combinations like Kanto. Although there might be a few too many legends for the first ever Pokémon games, but Ruby and Sapphire being the start still could have propelled Pokémon to its initial heights. However, I think there might be one option that could still possibly match the public fervor that made the series enjoyable from the very beginning. With the #1 spot, and it may be a surprise, but I truly think that Galar might be our best bet. It's got a lot going for it as an introduction to the Pokémon series if it were first, like the fact that any performance issues in its current state wouldn't be there because it would downscale it to the Game Boy, so nobody has to even worry about how the trees look. Also, the gyms are not that difficult either, with rather basic tests before simply entering the arena, so then each one could just be like a mini Elite Four with the different rooms. The wild area might need some alterations, maybe just make it like a Safari Zone thing, and maybe put it after the first gym instead, but on the whole the Galar region is a good beginner spot, as proven by so many people buying Sword and Shield, the most ever since the original games, so they were in fact the first for a whole new generation. But the regional makeup is only part of it. There's also the Pokémon that line up well for first-timers too, like the starters for instance. Here Magnolia gives you a choice of Pokémon that will remain monotyped the whole time, which leaves their relationships completely intact through your entire journey. Not that complicated. And there are a lot of other early Pokémon that at least start as a single stage to very easily teach you how a bunch of the matchups work in this universe. And we also see some of the traditional quirkiness that I was mentioning earlier, like say with Ice-Q or Phalanx or even a hair monster like Grimmsnarl. They're just weird, but it shows off the charm of the series rather well. And by the way, that's just the Galar Pokémon, but Sword and Shield had a number of older Pokémon too. However, if these were the first games, that would make all of them Galar Pokémon, I suppose. That means we do get to use Pikachu as the mascot if we want, and we also have classics like Eevee, Lucario, Snorlax, Gardevoir, and hey, even Charizard gets to be here, so don't you worry. Although that is a good point, I'm not even sure if Dynamaxing would still be in the game if Galar actually came first, since they wouldn't really need it to be there as a gimmick, but at the same time, just making the Pokémon bigger wouldn't be all that hard to pull off even on the Game Boy. At least it would be a lot easier than any of the other gimmicks, that's for sure. And that actually ties into the story pretty well, because the Dynamaxing is caused by the energy that Chairman Rose is trying to utilize. But of course, for most of the game, you have no idea about any of that, and you're just fighting Team Yell instead. So that sort of maintains the low-stakes appeal of Team Rocket, while also keeping a twist right at the end in the same vein as Giovanni or Blue becoming the champion. Not to mention you have 3 different rivals for whichever flavor you prefer. So the plot, the Pokémon, and even the layout are all pretty great for a starting point in the franchise. Although the DLC areas could be a lot harder to pull off on 90s hardware, but it's probably for the best to give us a break from all of those legends having to be in the first games anyway. But then again, I do love me some Regieleki, and it would be nice to have those legendary birds too. So it's hard to say whether the box art covers might have done as well without simple colors and using weapons instead. It could go either way, honestly, for the target demographic. But because of the ease of entry, combined with the dynamic pool of Pokémon available, the good, the bad, and the ugly, that's what makes it Pokémon, I do think that Galar could have successfully ushered in the Pokémon phenomenon to the same heights that we've witnessed in the past and maybe could see again in the future. Although I doubt they actually would have started with 400 Pokémon total, so we would have to cut some of them, or go crazy with the version exclusives, I guess. But those are just my assessments of which Pokémon regions could have potentially pulled off being the original generation and still make it the worldwide sensation generation we know it to be. And be sure to go to redproclub.com to get 10% off of your gaming needs today. Where do you think could have been the first generation? Let me know down in the comments. Also be sure to leave a like, share this video, and subscribe so that you too can become an Imperial today. And until next time, stay grounded!